As we saw with African ethical philosophy, we will see today that there is a great deal of variation in the African philosophy of mind. But we will also see, as we saw before in their ethical theory, that African philosophy makes unique contributions to the philosophy of mind that you cannot find elsewhere in Western thought. That's because Africans make different and arguably less assumptions about the mind than have many Western philosophers. Consider the Akan conception of the mind. And Akan is spelled A-K-A-N. Now, as we said before, the Akan are mostly located in Ghana and the Ivory Coast. Like many Western philosophers, the Akan do distinguish between the brain and the mind, and they also believe that the brain and the mind are interrelated. They mention, as evidence, that damage to the brain does affect a person's capacity for thought, showing the interrelationship between the brain and the mind in their view. But unlike many Western philosophers, the Akan do not believe the mind is a kind of thing that exists on its own and which sometimes thinks. Their view is actually more subtle than that. They believe the mind is the disposition or the inclination to think and is thinking itself. In other words, and I suggest you write this down, when thinking occurs, the mind occurs. Let me repeat that. When thinking occurs, the mind occurs. So it's not a case of supposing that there is a kind of thing called mind and that thoughts occur within it, like many in the West hold. They dispose of the mind as a permanent thing which sometimes think. Instead, they see mind as a consequence of thinking occurring. So in other words, when a thought occurs, mind arises in that moment. When thinking is not occurring, mind is not present. So mind is not an abiding kind of entity that exists all the time, whether one's thinking or doing any mental events or not. It only occurs when a mental event occurs. Now, because they are able to account for the experience of mind events without assuming the existence of a thing called mind, they fulfill one principle of making good explanations, a principle called Occam's razor. And Occam is spelled O-C-C-A-M. Occam's razor was invented by a 14th century logician and Franciscan friar named William of Occam. He was concerned with what makes one explanation better than another. He discovered two principles that make an explanation a better one. First, the explanation accounts for all the relevant phenomena and outcomes. Secondly, it is simpler than the competing theory. Let me repeat that. The two principles that make an explanation a better one according to William of Occam. First, the explanation accounts for all the relevant phenomena and outcomes. Secondly, It is simpler than the competing theory. By simplicity, Occam meant that it makes less assumptions than the other explanation. He said, and I quote, "Entities should not be multiplied unnecessarily," unquote. Now let me give you the definition of Occam's razor that will appear on your final exam. Occam's razor is the principle that the simplest explanation for some phenomenon is more likely to be accurate than more complicated explanations. So again, Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest explanation for some phenomenon is more likely to be accurate than more complicated explanations. So because the Akan can account for the experience of mental events without assuming the existence of an abiding mind, they have a simpler and arguably better explanation of the experience of mental events. Now we'll move on to another African group in their philosophy of mind, the Yoruba conception of mind. And you spell Yoruba Y-O-R-U-B-A. Yoruba. The Yoruba are a large group of people who live on the west coast of Africa. The Yoruba have a tripartite or three-part conception of the person. Here are the three parts. First, the body. Secondly, what they call the mind-soul. And thirdly, what they call the inner head. So let me give that to you again. The Yoruba tripartite conception of the person. First, the body. Secondly, the mind-soul. And thirdly, the inner head. Now, the body is physical in nature, but the mind, soul, and the inner head are spiritual. Just because the mind, soul, and the inner head are spiritual in nature, that doesn't make them the same. They are two distinct kinds of things, as we shall see. Now, as was said, the body is entirely physical, but the activity of the mind-soul makes it conscious or aware. The mind-soul is considered to be immortal. It transmigrates after the death of the body. So what is transmigration? Well, let me now give you a definition of transmigration that will appear on your final exam. Transmigration is the belief that the souls of the dead pass into other bodies whether human, animal, or into an inanimate object. Transmigration, again, the definition. Transmigration is the belief that the souls of the dead pass into other bodies, whether human, animal, or into an inanimate object. Now, plants and animals are said to have a mind soul. But even though it's the most enduring part of a person, it's not considered to be the source of personal identity. The reason the mind soul is not the source of personal identity is because it has no characteristics. It's like a foundation, something on which personal identity can be built upon, but is not personal identity itself. Viewing the mind soul as featureless is very different from the Western tradition, which ascribes many characteristics to the mind or the soul. So what is the source of personal identity for the Yoruba? It's the inner head. What is meant by this is the person's personality. Inner head means the person's personality. It is the personality of an individual that gives her her personal identity. Now, interestingly, the personality or inner head of an individual has a fundamental purpose or destiny. That purpose is to achieve self-actualization, to fully realize oneself in one's potential. It is necessary for an individual to live a good life to make sure that one is on track to achieving their potential. So there is some correspondence between the Yoruba and Aristotle, interestingly enough. What are some of the ways that we can check to see if we are achieving our own personal goals? And that's something you'll have to answer for yourself. What are some of the ways that we do that? Other African groups have a similar view. They also believe that a person's identity comes with a mission. And that mission, or that purpose, is to be creative. And creativity can take many forms. Creativity can come through having children or being procreative. It can come through labor or work. It can come through building good relationships with others or changing the world to make it better. But many will caution and say, what you must understand is that this purpose, this creativity, sometimes involves struggle. The struggle to bring meaning to one's life. Thank you.